Now that you've watched all the necessary videos and you also hopefully enjoy that delightful clip from the movie Mary Poppins, especially if you've seen the movie before and were well aware of the clip, I hope that you enjoy it in a new light than perhaps what you had typically thought of when you viewed it. I want to add I want to add to something that I didn't say in the last video, that the Bankses, and this is really for the people who are familiar with the movie, the Bankses would be from the middle or upper middle class, maybe the upper part of the middle class or the lower part of the upper middle class. If you recall the movie, George Banks, the father of the children, who sings a good portion of that song rather delightfully, he is trying to desperately become a partner in his bank. The other gentlemen who you see in the song are men of a higher stature. Even if they're from the same class, they are definitely from a higher stature. They're not nobility or aristocrats, but they are men of property, men of business, men of finance. They are investors. They are shareholders and stakeholders in this burgeoning early 20th century economy. And as you can see, they're also middle-aged men, so naturally they were also getting involved throughout the 1880s and 70s, 80s, and 90s. So things are looking really good for them. George Banks is by no means poor, but you see that he is struggling to make sure that his career stays on track throughout the movie. It's one of the reasons why Mary Poppins comes, because she's trying to help him rediscover what's really of value in life. He is trying to achieve some sort of status. And in the clip that you see, you can see that he's trying to guide his son as best he can into this world so that he can succeed and build upon his success. Because, like all parents, he wants his children to do better than what he had. So George Banks is a very sympathetic figure, but what I love about the clip is that all of these guys, and they're portrayed as being very quirky and even likable, if in some cases unlikable way. But the ideas of investing your money, building capital, acquiring more and more wealth, extending your credit and extending your influence through wealth. And I love the part where Banks begins to sing about railways through Africa, dams across the Nile, because you're like, oh, that sounds really good. I mean, that's exciting stuff, railways through Africa and dams across the Nile. But remember, England, Great Britain is not where the Nile is, and it's not in Africa. So the only way they're going to be able to do that is they go into those places, and they're not asking permission necessarily to do that. So you're building railways through Africa. You're building dams across the Nile. Tea plantations. Tea plantations are not in Great Britain either. They drink a lot of tea, but they don't grow tea in Great Britain. They grow tea in China and Asia, throughout Asia. We can also include maybe things like sugar. That wasn't mentioned, but sugar is very important. Rubber is very important. They are looking to invest their money and make money off of goods and material being shipped. They talk about shipping his materials back, making things, making money. And if you recall back to our lecture on industrialism, industrial manufacturing does two things. It creates the need for countries to go out and get raw materials that they do not have in their countries of origin, things like rubber and tea and sugar and Egyptian cotton and Indian cotton in general. And they need to in turn manufacture these things, and they don't just sell them to themselves. They turn around and sell them back to the places where they got these raw materials. And so that is the creation of a colonial and imperialistic economy, one in which you harness and control, you take control of the raw materials in a given area that's not yours through either overthrowing that government or establishing quasi-private corporations that might do that for you, or are somehow able to buy off the local government or create kind of, or maybe pit rivals against each other. So if you're going to, say, some African kingdom, and the African king doesn't want to deal with you, but you find maybe his brother in exile is willing to deal with you if you just give him some guns to overthrow his brother. it's all done very much to harness these types of assets. And I should also add that although by 1910 a lot of this has diminished, but slavery is enslaved individuals are assets too, although they're assets mostly of an earlier time. So I love thinking about those lyrics in that song. The song was written by the Sherman Brothers, and no doubt very, very brilliant writers and very crafty lyrics. It was meant to make a statement. And if you think about it and then think about it in the context of the things that we learned here, it does make kind of this great world of 1910 and all of these British gentlemen and that look a lot darker than perhaps what you might remember. But remember, this is just the way things were at the time. Let's not go after the Bankses. But I just like sharing that with you so you can just see it in a different light. So let us proceed. So I decided to take this one section of our lecture and divvy it up into two. So we have colonialism and imperialism prior to the 1880s and the 20th century, and we'll have colonialism, imperialism from the 1880s throughout the early 20th century when it really is on the rise. And the reason why I want to do this is because I want to share with you that colonialism and imperialism are nothing new in the 1880s and early 1900s. They really aren't. There are differences to them for sure, ideological differences, strategic differences, motivational differences, and of course, advancements in technology and industrial economy makes imperialism and colonialism a little bit different from when it was really getting big, and say during the Age of Discovery, people like Columbus and Captain Cook, James Cook, and during what's called the Age of the Sail, when people were still in wooden boats wearing tri-corner caps. So things were very different at the time. So let's go through just a very, very brief, I don't want to take up too much time for this, a very brief outline of colonialism and imperialism. And I know I'm beginning to realize that I have not put in place those definitions of colonialism and imperialism again. If you recall, at the end of last lecture, I did put them up there. And what I'll do in the next video is I'll put them up again and then kind of give you additional information on that. Mainly, though, we will be using them interchangeably, but there are some differences, and we'll talk about that in the next video so that we don't overburden ourselves. So let's talk about early colonialism and imperialism, simply so we can establish that one, it existed, and two, what made it different from what we're going to see in our time period. Now, this is where the video is going to go. So, as you can see here, map of European trade routes around 1750s. Yeah, this is nothing new. When Europe was able to develop its sailing abilities to a greater degree than it had previously, they began to simply just go all over the place. And there's a number of reasons why. We can boil these reasons to two. First, the need for spices. Raw goods in general, but spices for the most part. The spices and certain types of preserving agents, such as salt, but also things like cinnamon, nutmeg, turmeric, and different types of peppers and things like that. There's one in my mind that's not that was there, and I just missed it. And also things like tea, which the British didn't really drink before this period. And when all of a sudden they started visiting China and Asia, and they got a dose of tea, well, then they were just absolutely stuck on it, and they still are today. And the French, they don't drink tea much, but they drink coffee. And they are introduced to coffee along with the Spanish in the Americas, where coffee was grown, and it's also grown in Africa. So really, prior to this Age of Discovery from the 1400s throughout the 1700s, and that the British and all of Europe mainly get their goods, these types of goods like salt and different types of spices and other things like lacquerware, which is wood that has this polished lacquered material over it that you could use to make use as forks and spoons. Different types of things like trays, chairs, and tables. stuff like china, which is literally made in China, porcelain as we would call it, as well as spices and that. They would get it via the Silk Road. So Asia's over here. Silk Road cuts across the Middle East, Central and East Asia, over eventually making its way to Europe. But the problem was with the rise of Muslim empires like the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire, the British and Western Europeans, for various reasons, were not able to get their materials. On one hand, these empires, like any empire, wants to make money, and so they charged a sort of a toll fee to transport these goods overland through their lands and their territories. Also, the Muslims were expanding with great vigor through the Mediterranean world, and really up the Ottoman Empire makes it to literally to the gates of Vienna. So, had the Battle of Vienna, the Siege of Vienna, gone the other way, Vienna would have been occupied by Ottoman Muslims for a time, Muslim leaders and rulers. So the British were really not interested in going into Muslim lands. So they decided to find another route, and you know the rest of the story. Some, like the Portuguese, sailed around Africa and found their way to India that way. Christopher Columbus went west and eventually bumped into the Americas, and the world as we knew it changed forever. Over the course of those succeeding centuries, they simply tried to find good raw materials, such as spices mainly, and eventually things like gold and silver. The other motivation for doing this, sort of a twin justification, was that not only were European powers looking for these types of materials, these goods, these spices that they had grown accustomed to using and thoroughly enjoyed, but also they kind of cloaked themselves in righteousness and claimed that they were spreading Christianity as well. And a number of them were. They would send missionaries, Catholic priests, nuns, bishops. They would send soldiers, printmakers, people carrying Bibles, copies of Bibles. And they would, and sometimes they would voluntarily try to establish missions to spread the gospel. And other times they subjugated people and essentially forced the gospel onto them. So we could boil down this period of exploration and this period of imperialism and colonialism mostly through the need for spices and spreading the gospel. Ultimately, that's what it is. And you can see it's rather prevalent for the time. So what else do we have going on here? Gold and silver. The Spanish are spreading Christianity, but when they realize that the Americas are not Asia, they continue to set up colonies in the Caribbean, in Mexico, or what would become Mexico, Central America, and South America, and they locate actually a number of interesting things. Chocolate is one of them, or coca, but gold and silver, which they want badly. And so the Spanish focus on that, sending more of these metals, mining it out of the ground and sending it back to Europe, where it's minted into coinage and spent around the world to fund their various conquests. So that's not a spice, but it is a commodity. We also have the something that we don't think of much as a commodity, but was in fact a commodity, was the slave trade. And as you can see, the African slave trade was extremely prevalent. And this was conducted mainly by the Portuguese, but also by the British. And the French and the Spanish and them were involved too, as were the Dutch. But mainly this was a Portuguese and British affair, with the Portuguese really dominating the trade in this part of the globe, and maybe to a certain extent up maybe this far north, with the British dominating the rest of it over here, with a little help from the French as well. But this is what we have. We also have the trans-Saharan slave trade over here, and various other slave trades throughout the Indian Ocean area. Africans going into India and the Middle East, and later on, although they weren't slaves, Indians going into Africa. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. revolts and that happen as well. So again, we're going to see this type of stuff happen in our era, but it happened earlier too. In the case of the Dutch, who we don't talk about much, the Dutch developed a kind of quasi-private public corporation called the Dutch East India Corporation, who primarily dealt in trade, spices, spices and salt, and slaves to a certain extent. And in this case, they have Indians that they had subjugated because the Dutch had held India for a while before the British did. And the Indians eventually revolted in the mid 1850s. In this case here, this is a mutiny aboard a Dutch vessel where the Dutch were overthrown by the Indians, the Dutch were completely shocked by this, and the Indians just pretty much overthrew them. So this is nothing new. The United States is also not left out of the fun. In the 1850s, they sent a row of battleships, or should I say armored gunboats, steam-powered armored gunboats to Japan, who at that time had been closed off from most of the world under the control of the Tokugawa shogunate, or what we would simply refer to as the samurai governments. The United States showed up, and in a very nice and diplomatic way, essentially said that they need to open their country to trade, or else, well, what do you think the gunboats were for? And the various Marines that you see here lined up with all of their guns on display, the might of the American Navy and the American Marines. But again, all of this at the end of the day was a need to try and secure trade rights or control of goods and commodities, and also to spread Christianity. But over the course of the late 19th century, this will continue to grow, but become more and more dominated by Europeans as we go forward. You see, the problem, the thing that we have that's not really prevalent in our later period, this period here, is that so much of what's going on during this earlier period of colonialism is achieved either by random happenstance and luck, or good luck or bad luck, depending on who you identify with, or it was done through heavy cooperation with local leaders, specifically kings and monarchs of these various kingdoms. Now, it's not to say that local leadership and kings and monarchs will not play a role in the later period, but they're at an increased disadvantage technologically. You see, at this time, while the Europeans had guns and had really good ships, guns in the 1750s, as anybody who might be a gun enthusiast knows, were virtually worthless. I mean, they definitely served a purpose and were impressive. In some ways, they were scarier to see and hear than anything else because they had poor accuracy and it took forever to load. But people wanted guns, so they were willing to buy them. But if you look at Africa, for example, and you see these trade routes, notice that the lines kind of stop here along the edge of the country, or the continent. I'm sorry, I keep saying that, along the continent. And the reason why that is because Portuguese, Dutch, and British traders really couldn't go into the continent of Africa because the continent of Africa was very dangerous. Not only was the wildlife dangerous, not only did they could come across tribes that did not want them there, kingdoms that did not want them there, but also the diseases that were prevalent in Africa were such that Africa was nicknamed the white man's graveyard. So people who went into Africa who were European typically did not come out. On the flip side, because the Indians that lived in the Americas were never really exposed to the same types of diseases that were found in Asia, Africa, and Europe, their population started to dwindle because of these diseases. So the Europeans didn't have that kind of problem there. Instead, they had that problem if they tried to go into Africa. That problem will be rectified in the coming years, and we'll talk about that in the next video. So the Europeans might wield a lot of power. They have really good sailing ships. They do have guns and cannon, and they have a desire to explore and kind of branch out to spread Christianity or find these goods and commodities that they need. But they are still very much dependent on local power. Like I said, that won't completely go away, but at this time is much more tenuous. They cannot overthrow a lot of these governments, say in Africa, that they deal with. They can't overthrow Congo. They can't overthrow the Ashanti. They can't overthrow Mali and Ghana. They simply can't do that. Later on, however, that will change. So I am going to end this video here, take a break, kind of digest all of that. And I'm certain I probably forgot something in my extemporaneous speaking, but we will tie those loose ends up in our next video as we move forward from the 1880s into our period, which will overlap with with industrialism and all of the things that we talked about in the previous lecture. I will see you in the next video.